I have a couple of announcements. First of all, I was at Camp Nelson last Sunday. It was the last day of their 160th anniversary commemoration. And I took part in a panel discussion in the afternoon. And Dr. Giles was also part of that discussion. But my announcement has to do with a surprise. The reenactors of the 12th USC Heavy Artillery inducted her as an honorary member of the regiment because of all of her historical work that she has done over the years, both with the 12th and then with the African American cemeteries and other historical related issues. So I just wanted to share this picture with you. I couldn't get, we have Mr. Robert Bell and Mr. James Hunn, and there were three other gentlemen, but I was in the front row and I couldn't get them all in one picture. But I wanted to show you this. They presented her with a cap, and I thought that it would be appropriate to just announce that since she's one of our members. Okay. So in August, on August 17th, the third Saturday, Paul Bartels and Brittany Thompson will be presenting on, and this is an abbreviated summary of their title, The Necessity of Descendant Community Participation in Historical Sites. Paul Bartels has, I think, just recently retired from the Ashland organization in Lexington. And Brittany Thompson, I believe, is an intern or a research assistant at UK. September 21st, we'll have Hillary Delaney from Boone County Public Library, and she'll be, excuse me, presenting on the Underground Railroad in Northern Kentucky. And we chose September because September has been declared the Underground Railroad month, because in the month of September, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman both escaped from slavery. So we're looking forward to those two interesting presentations. Today, we have Jeff Smith, who's a long-term AAGGKY member. He retired after nearly 35 years in state and federal law enforcement, and now he exercises his investigative skills in genealogy and history research. This presentation will demonstrate the value of newspapers and genealogical research by focusing on the lives of African American soldiers following their return to civilian life after the Civil War. Newspapers were the news and social media outlets of the day, and in many instances mirror today's internet. Local newspapers are particularly valuable as they often include details that larger publications might overlook, such as community events, obituaries, and personal announcements. So, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully my technical challenges here have been overcome. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for allowing me to share with you this afternoon. I want this to be less of a presentation and more of sharing. And, you know, I titled this Looking for More, Seeking to Find the Rest of the Story. I will date myself just a little bit. Paul Harvey ran a series on the radio for a number of years, beginning in the mid-70s. And he always had this seemingly interesting story to share. His program was called The Rest of the Story. And I'm sure all of you, many of you, if not all of you, have had some story to share with your family and friends, and the story is so good you just can't keep it to yourself. So I, like many of us, didn't use newspapers as a resource for the longest time. And once I was turned on to that resource, that's the story I want to share with you today. So I know a lot of times we think of African American genealogy research and we think of our historical Black newspapers. And they definitely are valuable. I recall Tim Pennick did a very excellent presentation a few years ago for our group, talking about the value of those. But we sometimes don't think about just the standard newspapers of the time. So my hope is just to encourage you to consider using them as another tool and just look at it from the standpoint that it's always interesting to see that even though the emphasis for the time in the community was not necessarily geared towards a certain segment of the population, African Americans, there are some captures that you can utilize to further your research. So just sit back and relax and let me share some examples with you of using newspapers in your quest to find the rest of the story. So we think about puzzle pieces. And in all of our research, we see those little snapshots and pieces that we put together and try to bring into sharper focus to find the bigger picture. So we'll take a look at some isolated puzzle pieces today, and then we'll work our way deeper into some case studies from some research that I've been privileged to conduct as part of the research group in the Reckoning, Inc. Kentucky U.S. Colored Troops Project. But again, my main aim today is motivational and not instructional. So sit back and relax. Here we go. So just thinking in terms of what newspapers did back in the day, here's automation at its finest for the time period anyway, with a washing machine with even a personal endorsement from Mrs. E.J. Brown. But advertisements for cures for whatever diseases, indicating them being permanent or not. I was really taken with this modern drug dealing article from back in 1902 in the Stanford paper. But you think more in terms too of transportation for the time period. And for distance traveling, we were using the trains. You had schedules, you had the first and second train schedules for each day, and you had as well the fare cost. Local transportation, 1903, buggies were the order of the day, still in the early 1900s. You needed business resources. You needed an attorney. You needed a dental work to be done. Everyone had to have the staple products for foods. And you think of clothing. Early 1903, if you look in the papers, you would see all types of advertisements for all types of goods. For the time period that we're looking at, the two main sources of correspondence and communication for society then were newspapers and the mail. But it's interesting to see that the newspapers even were a backdrop for these undelivered, unclaimed mailings that were going to be filed, at least to send notices out to those that had not picked mail up. Here's an advertisement of a business, a barber who was in Lincoln County, Kentucky, in Crab Orchard. This came up in my personal research. And just a simple article like this, number one, to find Sam Blakemore, who married into my family, the Lincoln County branch of my family. But if you look at this, there are all types of clues here that would be helpful to find more of the rest of the story. We see where his business was located, and although the comments as to his skills in the one article are not very pleasantly stated, but nevertheless, it gives you a foothold for research in terms of looking geographically and looking for more of the story of your ancestors. In the personal ad section of the paper, we knew the visits that were taking place and the travels that were taking place. On that line, we think in terms maybe not of the African-American community, albeit a little later in time. We see here that a visit by Molly Fish going to visit Mr. and Mrs. Henry Fish in Danville. So we know there's a connection. Who is Henry Fish to Molly Fish? They must have been close, obviously sharing a name, but she visited, and as well, they accompanied her back home. The colored notes sections of the newspaper, here the Lexington paper, carried an article all the way from Lexington to Little Crab Orchard to the Christian church with an anniversary being celebrated. We learn a lot from the article in terms of the elder of the church. One of the older members is Molly Fish, the pastor that was there, but all types of information to lead you into further research. And just to look a little bit closer at Molly Fish, only with respect to the benefit of death notices. Here are the surviving family members listed when she passed away at 100 years of age. You look in terms of the friends, and you just start developing a network of community. You see a church association, and although Molly Fish was mentioned at the Crab Orchard Christian Church, we see the funeral services are being held at the Crab Orchard Baptist Church. We got the pastor that's officiating for the ceremony and place of burial. As far as that network of community, the article even went so far as, another article went so far as to even carry the people that were in visiting from out of town to the funeral. So we know that there's a relationship, whether it be family or whether it be friends, a sense of community over time with the periods. This was a gem of an article that I ran across when doing some research with regards to one of our soldiers. The enslaver for that soldier was Bennett Hyatt. And although the soldier will not be addressed in the case study we're looking at today, this really struck me because look at the information that's here. You have the paper out of Stanford reporting on Mount Vernon, Rockcastle County, just to the south of Lincoln County. But you have two African-American ladies that pass away, and the article goes so far as to indicate that they were from the slave era. It even goes so far as to talk about their enslaver and the circumstances under which one of them was purchased by her husband. And you even see information with regards to one of the ladies. She was bought by a child from Georgia by the enslaver and served there until she was freed. Where else would you find this type of information? I want to take a little detour and look at some historical markers. Our newspapers show, in this instance, here's Ivan, an escaped slave. He's run away. But the information that's here, you have his enslaver attempting to recover him, putting a reward out. But we also see from the article the place that he was hired out to. His enslaver was out of Boyle County around Perryville, but it looks as if he was in the north of Harrodsburg working, was the last place he was located. Ivan is somebody's ancestor, but the richness of the information that's here as far as the enslaver and as far as a place of employment for him or the place that he was enslaved and working gives you a foothold into more information. And I wish that this was a project that I was working on. Here's a land sale taking place where you have an estate and you have the identified person that owned the estate, but you have a sale taking place of land. Along with that land, you have enslaved individuals that are being sold with that property. They are listed by name and by age. This would be a gem to research into, with at least some great leads here to identify the individuals. We think in terms of the context and setting of the times that our ancestors would have lived in. Here's an article from 1853, and in essence is a day law in Danville, where the enslaved individuals could not be in public present without benefit of a written pass from his or her master or overseer, with a pretty harsh penalty for violation of the order. One of the educational institutions of the day, and really I think one of the pioneers of interracial education, Berea College, is interesting. We were just mentioning Berea College in our pre-meeting comments, but Berea College, the advertisements of its availability, at least up until the time that the interracial aspects of school there were reversed. But it's interesting to see these historical markers over time for our newspapers. So let's start looking here at something on the lighter side. Here from the Central Record in Lancaster in 1899 is an article where Mr. Harmon, described as a colored man, advertising the record for a wife. I'm not sure what his ad said, but he was successful in securing a wife through an ad that he put in the paper. I think this probably is a forerunner of the dating apps that are available currently on the internet. So Let's take a look at some case studies now and look and see how newspapers figured into finding more of the rest of the story with regards to these soldiers. I do want to say this. Although not to be addressed today, we do not want to diminish the military service and sacrifice of the soldiers, but we'll be highlighting and looking more so at their post-military service life. Our first soldier has two names, and typically we see two names, but rarely do we see a given and surname being different. Surname's different, yes, but James Combs, aka Duncan Burns, was the first soldier we'll take a look at. James, I'll refer to him as that was his name at enlistment. Enlisted at 19 years of age. He was born in Bullitt County, Kentucky, and we see his enlistment and the area of service that he was assigned to. We see from his muster out record that he mustered out at Galveston, Texas, February 1866. And I do want to pause just for a minute. It's interesting to look at that being about 8 months after General Order Number 3 being read and the proclamation of slaves being freed in Texas. So we can have at least some idea as to what he may have been engaged in during his time there. Now, what's interesting is this is his pension index card. And the pension index card tells us that he settles eventually in Louisiana, if you see the marker there. But 4 years after he's out of service, he's on the 1870 census living with his presumed mother in Louisville, Kentucky. A little bit interesting to see making his way all the way back there and then supposedly making his way at some point to Louisiana. Here's an article from 1875, June of 1875, and as they say, a difficulty occurred, but there was an incident on a plantation, the Crosley-Theobald's plantation in Louisiana. This article carries details as to apparently one of the plantation owners in a dispute with one of the workers in which he wound up shooting the worker. Now, we look at it from two standpoints. Number one, we're still with the plantations. We're post-enslavement. Obviously, labor jobs were the order of the day. He does survive his injury, as is indicated in the article, hopes of that. There is an initial charge file, but we want to look a little bit more closely at the fact that this gives us a footprint for Duncan Burns under his name of Duncan versus his enlistment name, being in Louisiana. The 1880 census in the James Parish, what's interesting is to see as well, and I recall this very specifically in research, trying to ensure that due diligence was given to having the right persons in the right places. But here Duncan Burns is enumerated on the census in 1880 in very close proximity to his future wife. The two of them, Josephine would marry Duncan in Ascension, Louisiana in 1890. But this gives you some idea in terms of at least the value that you can find in research for newspapers. We'll go to our next soldier. And I think what will be interesting to see about our next soldier, Abraham Finch, is that Abraham was 38 years of age when he enlisted. From those soldiers I've had the privilege of researching, I think he's the oldest soldier at enlistment. But we see that he was born in Shelby County, Kentucky. He enlisted at Louisville. And what was interesting with regards to Abraham, he is going to muster out in Washington, D.C. in 1866. And we'll see eventually him settling in Connecticut by virtue of his pension index card. Here we have a newspaper article out of Hartford, the Hartford Courant. Unfortunately, it reports Abraham's divorce from his wife, Sarah Ann Finch, due to adultery, but it does give us some footprints there that they married in 1866. And if you see from the article there, he was roughly a month out of military service when he married, And unfortunately, 5 years later, this shows his divorce in 1871. And I'm not sure what happened in between time, but 25 years later, he marries again, and he marries Ellen Knight of Hartford. The newspaper again capturing that marriage. In February 1899, there was a trolley strike that took place that the Courant reported, where the suburban trolley men, they're tired of promises, they want to be paid. There were 27 men involved in this work situation. The trolley line, of course, is described there in terms of the route that was run. But the men that were involved in this strike and that were put in a position of not being paid, they received some benevolence from the area there, but that's not what they were desirous of. They wanted to work. But in the profile of those individuals involved in the strike is Abraham Finch. And it's interesting to see that we learned so much from his article. The article here, we learn how much time that he has been in Connecticut. We learn about of course, his employment. We learned that he has a wife and a child, and we learned that his wife's aged uncle lives with them. And if you look closely there, you'll see that, not only has he been out of work, but he's been ill himself for nearly a month. So he has, in addition to the normal day-to-day expenses to be taken care of, he has as well his medical expenses that he is responsible for. But again, the value of the articles gives us a lot of foothold. Again, I think it's interesting too, the characterization of these men to include Abraham. But imagine the time period and how disorderly and how much problem there could have been with regards to the fact that these men were not being paid. But the description of the character of the men in terms of how they conducted themselves in the course of this, it's goes a long way to show and give us a foothold with regards to his time there. In May of 1902, there's an article that speaks of a 4-year-old boy that was visiting Abraham Finch. And unfortunately, he is the victim of a little, probably tomfoolery, but he finds a carboy, which I understand is a storage container, and it contains vitriol, which research tells me is sulfuric acid. And unfortunately, he ran a stick into that and then ran it across his face. But again, it's located behind a store, but again, an incident in the life of Abraham Finch is looked at. This next article is very unusual, and it's in a sense, it is obviously an unfortunate set of circumstances, but it describes in 1911 an automobile accident that took place. And it's interesting how they refer to the article, but the accident winds up happening on Asylum Street, of all names, under the railroad bridge. But a U.S. mail wagon, which I eventually, when I read the article and research, thought maybe it was going to be horse-driven. They did have motorized. From the article, it would suggest that it was not horse-driven, but you have a U.S. mail wagon that collides with a chauffeur-driven automobile. The article is very specific with regards to what takes place. And just for reference, again, this is Abraham's wife walking along the street, and she is struck by the automobile, which has been pressed in her direction by the mail wagon colliding with it. You've got wet streets, which did not help, but Mrs. Finch was walking down the street, struck and knocked down. Thankfully, the vehicle goes over her, but the wheels do not pass over her. She's carried to the hospital and does survive the accident. I thought it very interesting in the investigation that was conducted. You have an 18-year-old wagon driver who was found to be at fault. Distraction. He was distracted. One thing we can say for sure is he was not texting on his cell phone, but was distracted enough to have struck the vehicle. In 1915, we see another capture of Mrs. Finch. And unfortunately, she is on the other end of law enforcement in this instance. Apparently, there was a disturbance, noise disturbance that was taking place early morning at her residence. The article suggests maybe that there was what some would consider singing, but she is charged as a result of this incident with keeping a disorderly house, and then there are several other individuals that are charged with breach of peace. But again, it gives you an idea and foothold in terms of some of the captures that can be found with regards to African Americans, again, in non-standard places, our standard newspapers for the time. Our next soldier that we'll look at is Joseph Wathan. And Joseph was born in Nelson County, Kentucky. He enlisted at 18 years of age, and we see his enlistment and his assignment to Company C of the 5th Regiment, U.S. Colored Cavalry. We'll take a look at him. He is mustering out in 1866 in Arkansas, and he is going to return to the Louisville, Indiana area. In May of 1890, the Messenger Inquirer carried an article reporting out of Louisville, Kentucky, of an incident or accident that took place with fatalities. Looking at the caisson that collapsed, there were several workers who were missing after the caisson collapsed and presumably drowned. Unfortunately, Joseph Wathan was one of those individuals. But from the article profiling him out of this incident, we learn a lot about him. He was 44 years of age, had lived in Jeffersonville. He worked on that project for about a year. Again, it gives us a foothold to put puzzle pieces together. This gives you an idea of the caisson. What was very interesting is for the time period, the steps that were taken in investigating this accident. There's an inquest that's held. There were searches that were conducted after the incident, checking at the residences of those that were missing just to ensure that they had not survived and made their way back home. But again, unfortunately, Joseph was one of the fatalities. The bodies were never recovered in the course of that which had transpired. You know, our next next soldier we'll look at was Heinz Foster, and again, he's one of our soldiers that had two different names. Be at this time, his given name was the same, but two different surnames. We'll just refer to him as Heinz through the course. But Heinz was enlisted at age 21. He was born in Nelson County, Kentucky. Excuse me. And he enlisted at Louisville. We'll take a quick look because there's quite a bit of capture with regards to Heinz. Heinz mustered out, similar to Joseph, in Helena, Arkansas in March of 1866. And he is going to return to Nelson County, Kentucky, his place of birth. Here in 1891, the Weekly Leader captures an article about the Republican Party delegates that were being sent to the state convention at Lexington. Heinz Beam was one of the individuals that was set as a delegate to attend the convention out of Nelson County, Kentucky, after the Republicans of Nelson County met at Bardstown. Here's a Frankfurt article, 1891, a little later that year. And what's interesting is Heinz Beam is visiting Frankfurt. And he is visiting his kids who are enrolled in the state normal school, which is the early forerunner of Kentucky State University. There's so much detail that's lifted out of here in terms of characterizing Heinz. They, as you see, describe him as the leading citizens of his community. He holds a lot of land. He's a good character. It talks about his employment, but it also speaks as to the large influence he has in his county, even outside of his race. In 1901, the Courier Journal carries an article about the colored fair, and speaks as to the prominence of the cakewalk, as you can see from the headline. But there were a number of events held, and it speaks to the history of this event. But what was one of the interesting things in this is the fact that you had different types of events taking places, and you had judges. So among the judges, when they're looking at the various activities there, are Heinz Beam and Lud Beam. And I will say this, Lud Beam is, we determined from a research project, was another soldier, but he was also the brother of Heinz. But they are among the judges. In 1903, here's a Courier Journal article that speaks to, we know all good things must come to an end, but it speaks to the passing of the stagecoach. The stagecoach had been utilized to run mail in the area of Nelson County, and you see the routes taken and the communities covered. But due to other competition from rail, they had lost revenue, and it was on the decrease. One of the other issues that were encountered, and I'll digress here, we see the time period of Heinz Beam and his brother is referred to in the article. For about a 2-year time period, they were running the stagecoach for that run. But let me back up here. One of the things I wanted to point out was, one of the things that wound up happening, and we saw the same thing, I think, in a sense today. The article speaks to what they call hucksters that were running for limited cost and fare and free mail pickup. They were providing, the hucksters were the individuals that had the fruit and produce stands and work with the gardeners, but they were essentially taking away from the revenue from something that cost by providing a free service. And it just reminded me of current day time, more so that we're familiar with the decrease in our cab services, where we had a lot of our transportation services that came into existence, Uber and Lyft and so forth. I know from the earlier article we saw with regards to Heinz, his employment, he was a U.S. government employee. Ancestry had a register that had civil, military, naval service employment records or tax records in them. And it was interesting to see amongst the individuals there were Heinz Beam. He was a storekeeper and gauger. And in essence, he was helping to stock supplies and handle inventory for military-related goods for any future engagements that the country may be involved in. But to look in terms of the reference to his land holdings, think in terms for the time period, this goes all the way across to show him being from Nelson County, but this goes and shows the course of his of income, which for the time period was quite substantial. I hope that this gives you at least some flavor for just the value of newspapers and finding the rest of your story or making attempts to do so. Again, and being privileged to do research in this project and in my personal research and finding just over the course, just the value that newspapers have served in my personal research and in this project. I just want to encourage you to look at that as a course to be followed. I did want to hit here at least to make you aware that there are some free resources that are out there. Each area, I think, provides at least something that if you decide to look at it, to look and see what best works for you. Chronicling America, I've utilized the Kentucky Digital Library. I have not used FamilySearch.org. Of course, it is a free site. There's a catalog listing for the collections they have. I have utilized primarily newspapers.com, and really the link between there and Ancestry, just the way that I have my subscription set up, it makes it well. Of course, you may look too, because if you're a full 3 member, there's always some discounts available when you perhaps bundle, but there are free resources at least to take a look at. And as well, just try a trial if you decide to look in terms of any of the cost subscriptions. I do want to refer you to, there's a video on YouTube that Lisa Louise Cook has, where she gives some guidance as to free old newspapers online, and I believe that's through Google. I have not used that resource, but wanted to bring it to your attention. But again, hopefully now you know more of the rest of the story in terms of some of these individuals, and hopefully you'll be encouraged at least to look at newspapers in the course of your endeavors, because again, I was excited with the things I have found over the years. I've encouraged others and wanted to encourage you today just to consider newspapers as a resource if you haven't already made use of them. Thank you.